They went from being Turkey's rising opposition to political pariahs. With both their party leaders out of parliament and in prison, we ask if this is the end of the HDP. Also on today's program, China's expanding influence. Has the Chinese military gone into Afghanistan? And in a new segment, throwback, whatever happened to Zika? The epidemic caused panic 2 years ago. Where's the virus now? I'm Imran Garta, and this is the Newsmakers. They were seen as a rising political force in Turkey, the People's Democratic Party, known by their Turkish abbreviation, the HDP. They were elected to parliament for the first time in 2015. They projected an image of pluralism, a party that would fight for minorities and human rights, a message that appealed to many Kurds as well as urban liberals and secularists. Their historic success was seen as a sign that Kurdish representation was entering the mainstream. But less than 2 years later, they've lost more than a quarter of their seats in the Grand National Assembly. The party's chairman is in prison, and prosecutors hope to keep him there for 142 years. And just last week, the party's chairwoman was stripped of her place in parliament. So what happened? Critics say the HDP hasn't done enough to distance themselves from the terror group, the PKK. Our newsmaker today is the HDP, as we ask whether they've been unfairly targeted or if they've hurt their own cause and squandered their legitimacy.
It was a landmark victory. The People's Democratic Party, or HDP, swept into parliament in 2015 on a wave of optimism and defiance, issuing a challenge to Turkey's ruling Justice and Development Party from the very beginning.
There is no room now for you to look down on us from the balcony and shake fingers at us in this country. Now you will be speaking to us on the same level. Get used to it. Those days are over.
Kurdish political parties had for decades been shut down or brought before the Constitutional Court of Turkey to be banned. All had links with the PKK, a separatist group designated as a terror organization by Turkey, the US, and the EU. But after the height of that conflict in the 1990s, Turkey's political environment opened up during Recep Tayyip Erdogan's 11-year tenure as prime minister. Election materials, for instance, were allowed to be delivered in languages other than Turkish. Such reforms set the stage for the rise of the HDP. It became the first predominantly pro-Kurdish movement to enter parliament as a political party, rather than through independent candidates, a method used to get over Turkey's 10% electoral threshold. But ultimately, the HDP's ascent was short-lived. Within weeks of its entrance to parliament, the PKK broke the 2.5-year-long ceasefire and violence escalated. What would follow would be a confluence of events that would radically alter Turkey's political environment. HDP politicians have publicly acknowledged their links to militant organizations in the region.
Biz sırtımızı YPG'ye, YPJ'ye ve PYD'ye yaslıyoruz. Bunu söylemekte, bunu savunmakta.
And they have also alluded to the pressure of operating politically in parts of the country where the PKK exerts considerable power.
PKK'nın öyle bir gücü var ki, PKK sizi tükürüğüyle boğar, tükürüğüyle.
After the failed coup attempt last July, HDP members were arrested and accused of having ties to the PKK. They included the co-chairs Selahattin Demirtaş and Figen Yüksekta. Yüksekta has since been stripped of her title. Some Kurds say the HDP is being unfairly targeted, and if it were the political wing of the PKK, it would never have been elected, because the PKK is deeply unpopular with most Kurds.
It's a political decision. It can't be more than that. If the leader of the party has 6 million votes, and if 13 MPs of this party are in parliament, it's nothing but a political arrest. The HDP is not working for the PKK. I don't believe that. The HDP is against violent acts, both by the PKK and Turks.
But Mehmet Amin Akinci, who runs a small restaurant in the same Kurdish neighborhood of Istanbul, says that the HDP was more interested in serving the PKK than the people who elected it to power.
It's already obvious where they're taking orders. It doesn't represent me. I, as a Kurd and Arab, opened a restaurant in the oldest and most historical location in Turkey. The government doesn't impose any restrictions on me. So, I don't accept that the HDP represents me.
There's a divide in Turkey's Kurdish community over the HDP, whether it's ultimately responsible for its own demise, and conversely, whether the government has deliberately sought to dismantle a party that still remains third largest in parliament, and one which stands in opposition to a constitutional reform proposal set to be put to a referendum next month. What is clear is that the HDP has lost support among Kurds as the PKK has stepped up its attacks. Now, the HDP's survival may depend on peace talks and the PKK laying down arms once and for all. And while this sensitive topic is discussed in hushed tones among Kurds, many wonder if this is the end of the HDP. Will they again have a party of their own? Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers in Istanbul.
I'm joined now here in the studio by Ceren Kenar. She's a journalist specializing in the Middle East, and Galip Dalay, the research director of Ashaq Forum. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us. Galip, a couple years ago, June 2015, first round of the elections, there was a sense of hope in the Turkish democratic process, given the example of the HDP, the third biggest party. They got 13% of the vote. You even wrote positively about it, the fact that these new kids on the block are a sign that things are healthy and moving forward. A couple years later, or a year and a half later, everything seems to be falling apart for the HDP. What went wrong?
Well, what went wrong, the primary reason was what went wrong with the Kurdish peace process, and what went wrong with the Kurdish peace process was very much also dependent on the political calculation of the PKK, mainly driven by its consideration vis-a-vis the Syria. And when the PKK decided to go back to the fighting, the HDP faced a dilemma, whether to remain within the political spheres, meaning that like putting some distance between itself and the PKK, or to be regarded as more or less reduce itself to the political wing of the PKK. Unfortunately, one of the decisions that the HDP made was more or less reduce it to be perceived as the political wing of the PKK, because the HDP had an opportunity this time. Traditionally, the pro-Kurdish party received around 6.57% of the vote, and back then the argument that our social base and the PKK social base more or less are the same was valid. But HDP received around 13% of the votes. That means 50% of the increase. And vast majority of these new voters were not socialized into politics by the PKK. So HDP should have tapped into this new opportunity. But unfortunately, the HDP was unable. You can cite many factors. Some of them, like, you know, some of them was natural, because HDP could not face the PKK when the PKK and Turkey enmeshed in such a fierce fighting. But nevertheless, the HDP could have made itself much more and different voice than the PKK. This is, like, you know, where unfortunately it failed, and this is where unfortunately its fate very much was related to that of the PKK.
So, Ceren, I mean, there was a point in time when during the peace process, there were arguments that, hey, their links to the PKK might be useful because they can be mediators or interlocutors. Was that only useful for as long as there was dialogue? Once it became conflict again, they needed to make a choice?
Yeah, I think this is a very fair question, but in order to become a mediator, you actually have to be an agent, be an actor. I think this process actually demonstrated us that HDP was not an actor that many hoped it become one. So it was not, as Galip said, it actually couldn't distance itself from PKK, and it's quite barbaric events during the last couple of years in Turkey, and even Kurds in Turkey who vote for HDP. Opinion polls show that these people also hold PKK culpable and responsible of the end of the peace process. So it actually shows that the decline of the votes of HDP actually shows that many Kurds, and as well as Turks who voted the party for the hopes that this party can be a new left-wing liberal voice in Turkish political spectrum, they actually also think HDP is very much linked to PKK,
Right.
and therefore hold HDP as well as PKK responsible for the increasing violence in Turkey.
So they got 13% of the vote in the June election, and then later on in the year, in November, they got just over 10, and they lost 1 million votes. And as has been established, not only did they tap into a Kurdish base, but there were many leftists, many secularists who, I guess maybe the nationalism of the MHP or the Kemalism of the CHP and so on didn't appeal to them, so they thought, okay, this is for us. Those people, if there was an election today, who would they vote for?
Well, I think, like, those people, who would they elect? It's very hard to answer it because those people is probably very much disillusioned. And one of the reasons that they went to the HDP was because of their disillusionment with previous parties. But some of these votes already went to, we know where it went. It went to the AK Party, because the argument that the new voters mostly came from the liberal or the left-wing or non-Kurds are not correct, because actually the increase of the HDP mostly came from the conservative Kurds, not from the liberal or the left-leaning so-called, let's say, like Turks. So therefore, the main reason for these conservative Kurds turning away from the AK Party to the HDP was very much related with the assumption that if the HDP is politically strengthened, it will become a much more strong agency in the Kurdish peace process, and that means the Kurdish peace process will transition from being a military conflict to a political process. So that was the main reasoning of most of the conservative Kurds. But when the HDP reduced itself more or less to an ideological challenge to the AK Party, and basically like creating more and more, it's being based on creating AK Party as its constitutive author, and also not making a distinction between where it stands and where PKK stands.
Yeah, and they didn't make that. Yeah, they didn't make that distinction.
But that doesn't mean that they have to completely cut ties with the PKK.
Right.
It means that putting a different argument, a different narrative than this of the PKK.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And so, okay, there has been ample evidence of collusion sometimes, of connections at other times, and so on. I mean, these are not just like wiretaps or whatever. You know, they're people found with weapons, or leaders at rallies carrying the coffins of suicide bombers, and so on. Now, in response to that, and in response to other things, there have been crackdowns. The leadership's in jail. Parliamentarians have been, kicked out of parliament. Has the crackdown on the HDP been fair, Ceren?
I think it's not helpful to solve the Kurdish issue in Turkey, this kind of a crackdown. Whether it's fair or not, whether it's legal or not, that's a different question. These are either, moral or legal questions. But as an observer...
Has the crackdown matched what they've done wrong?
The thing is, I don't think that the Kurdish issue in Turkey can only solve through military terms, because this is a political problem. It has cultural roots. So in order to address the demands of the Kurds in Turkey, the government could have adopted a different strategy, which is to fight against PKK, which is a just war, which is a legitimate war, because the government tried to settle a peace process with PKK, and despite that effort, PKK violated the ceasefire. And it started attacks in Turkish major cities, not only against Turkish military targets, but also civilians.
Yes.
So the war against PKK is quite fair in that sense. However, if the government had differentiated between the military and political aspects of that issue, I think it would have garnered more support among the Kurdish population in Turkey. When you ask whether those votes that some Kurds stopped voting for HDP, some of those votes turned back to AKP, that's true. But I think there are still a proportion of delusioned Kurdish voters in Turkey who are both alienated from PKK, but also alienated from the government.
So you're saying that both the HDP and the government need to make that bigger distinction between fighting and politics and who you talk to, right?
Exactly.
And in the middle of a conflict, it's very difficult to do that, right? Galip, there is a vote coming up, and we're all trying to speculate how people will vote. It's a very simple yes or no in April. How will that constitutional referendum affect the HDP, whether it goes yes or no?
Well, for the time being, HDP stands with the no, and HDP is very much powerful when it comes to controlling its social base. So HDP is one of the party, unlike the MHP. If the HDP leadership goes for the no, that means vast majority of the HDP social constituency goes for the no. But I want to add another dimension. One of the trouble in the current strategy, this issue, you cannot just reduce the political issue to a legal one. So right now, just going after the HDP lawmakers or the mayors through the legal arguments or the legal processes will not be helpful, because in the end, the legal process, the state of Turkey's legal system is not known for the most liberal flavor. So that will actually complicate the question rather than solve it, because still we have the core of this constitution remains from the 1980s coup constitution, and that's why every single political party in Turkey is unhappy with this constitution. So if you go after a political question with a constitution and legal system that is the reminiscent of 1980s coup, it's not very helpful. You will only aggravate the political process. So while to some extent the legal process was fair and justified, because once you are asked to go to appear in the court, you should abide by this. So this is like, fair and fair. But reducing the whole matter to that of a legal one, I'm not sure to what extent it's going to be very helpful in dealing with this issue.
Final question for you, Ceren. Can they come back to the sort of legitimacy they had in June 2015, or will that only ever happen a long time after there's another ceasefire?
I think the damage is done. So HDP lost a lot of credibility, not only in the eyes of the Turkish public opinion, but also among Kurdish voters. And so did PKK. People's lives were ruined, destroyed. I've been to the southeast in Turkey while the clashes was going on. The picture is gloomy. So these people these Kurds hold PKK responsible of the end of the ceasefire, which they benefited a lot in terms of security, economic reasons. The tourism was flourishing in that era, in that region where there are clashes going on right now. So the thing is, I think it will take a long time and a need for a total renovation of HDP to gain that kind of a support among Kurds and Turks again. And HDP, there are leading HDP politicians right now who are giving interviews, quite self-reflexive interviews, I must say. They are critical about PKK, they're being critical about their own party, they're admitting the mistake. I think these are important steps, but it's too little and too late.
Okay, Ceren and Galip, I wish we had more time. This is a fascinating topic. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
China has been expanding its role along its western border. It recently acted as a go-between in peace talks between the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government, arguing that its aim is to control the growing presence of militant groups in the region. But recently, Chinese military personnel have reportedly been spotted conducting patrols within Afghanistan. These patrols are said to have taken place in the Wakhan Corridor, a narrow triangular stretch of Afghan territory. It separates Pakistan from Tajikistan and is bordered in the north by China's Muslim-majority Xinjiang province. That's been the center of an insurgency by the local Uyghur population, which has demanded greater autonomy from Beijing. Let's get more on the story from freelance journalist France J. Marty. He joins us now from Kabul. He's one of the few reporters actually covering the story. Good to have you on the program, France. So, first up, are they actually in Afghanistan? Are Chinese soldiers there on the ground?
Thanks for having me. There is really overwhelming evidence that at least last year, during 2016, there have been patrols with Chinese participation. I have myself seen an eyewitness report, a written eyewitness report, very detailed about a control by such a patrol of the eyewitness. I have seen photographs myself of clearly Chinese vehicles and several other sources. Most importantly, also a Chinese official familiar with the matter confirmed this to me on the condition of anonymity. Right now, those joint patrols have apparently been suspended, according to my Chinese source, because it became public, and apparently not everyone in the Afghan government was informed about it, and so the Afghan side suspended it. And at the moment, there are no patrols, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and thanks for doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this. It's great that you've been doing the investigative journalism. So their response, a couple of quotes. Interestingly, there's one quote where they say the report that the Chinese military patrolled in Afghanistan is false. But then, of course, there was the other quote, and I think this came from you, that these are joint counter-terrorism operations with Kabul. That's what the Chinese said. So, it makes us wonder, is it that, or is it just more than that? Is it joint counterterrorism, or does it go deeper than that?
Also, let's say like this, it's a little bit hard to identify what Chinese troops we are actually talking about. As for example, my Chinese source told me that it's not military, it is like border police, but he didn't really specify which unit that would be. So there exists a quadrilateral cooperation and coordination mechanism between China, Tajikistan, Afghanistan and Pakistan regulating military coordination and cooperation. And my Chinese source, these patrols are not part of it. Apparently there is a separate agreement between China and Afghanistan and Tajikistan to conduct those joint patrols with participation of officials from those three countries. The reason that Tajikistan is also involved is quite simple. The high plateau, the little Pamir where the patrols are conducted, is only to be reached by a vehicle from the Tajik side. From the Afghan and from the Chinese side, the mountains block the access.
Okay, Franz, it's great to get your on-the-ground experience and analysis. It's been fascinating talking to you. Hope to have you on the program again. Franz J. Marty joining us there from Kabul. Whatever happened to the Zika virus? It gained notoriety in Brazil in 2015. Pictures of newborn babies with microcephaly saddened people around the world. And Zika even threatened to disrupt the Rio Olympic Games. Introducing a new segment, Throwback, where we take a story that's fallen out of the headlines. So where is Zika now?
Zika was a little-known virus, named after the forest where it was first discovered in monkeys in 1947. Its carrier, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, wasn't known to travel very far. But in 2015, Brazil sounded the alarm. Zika had made its way to South America and was spreading fast. And most shocking, its effect on pregnant women who gave birth to babies with microcephaly, a mutation that causes an abnormally small head.
To have a tenfold increase in numbers, we believe is a matter of public health concern and constitutes an international emergency.
With the Rio Olympic Games around the corner, there was panic.
The big fear is that they're going to go home with more than souvenirs. This is already a pandemic. It's spreading very rapidly.
Zika is now a global epidemic. The most recent infections have been found in Southeast Asia. It's also rare. Only 1 in 4 people develop symptoms, and they're usually mild. Experts have also confirmed that sexual transmission is possible. Since last year, the spread of Zika has slowed in countries like Brazil and Colombia. But in places like Puerto Rico, the number of cases is rising. The Aedes mosquito has become more numerous. It's also evolved to live closer to humans and is now spreading other diseases.
The spread of Zika, the resurgence of dengue, and the emergent threat of chikungunya are the price being paid for a massive policy failure that dropped the ball on mosquito control in the 1970s.
Scientists think they have a solution. Genetically modifying sterile mosquitoes and releasing them can reduce populations by 90%. But there's still no vaccine, and there's no cure for the thousands of babies suffering from microcephaly. Doctors recently discovered that Zika can cause other health problems.
complications with the eyes, with swallowing. We're seeing babies born with stiff limbs and having seizures. So we know now that this is encompassing something that we call congenital Zika syndrome.
Another side effect has been a heated debate in Brazil about access to abortion, which is illegal. The new Conservative Congress has proposed laws to increase jail time for women who abort fetuses with microcephaly. One rights group has launched a legal challenge before Brazil's Supreme Court.
When it comes to Zika, we are talking about an epidemic of mental suffering imposed on women. Because of the uncertainty that comes with going ahead with a pregnancy, brings unknown consequences.
The media coverage might have subsided, but certainly the activity and the transmission is not gone. So Zika is certainly still here, and I think it's going to be quite some time before we really see a true interruption of Zika, if ever.
Are there news stories you're still curious about? We'd love to know. Get in touch, tweet me at Imran Garda or use the hashtag #TheNewsmakers. We'll revisit them here on the show. Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.